Hello, and welcome to a slightly different episode of Haunted Histories. If you hear barking outside, it's because that's my dog, and there are seagulls flying around. I'm 20 miles from the coast. I don't know why there are seagulls, but there are, and he doesn't like them. But hopefully that won't detract too much from the subject that we're going to be talking about. Now, I did have a guest lined up for September, but unfortunately, a combination of myself getting COVID quite badly and being quite poorly for a week, and her not being able to reschedule for that week. I'm not sure when she's going to be coming on, but I'm chasing her and I'm stalking her, as you can imagine. So, a bit of a different Haunted Histories, and I thought what I would do is talk about an area for the next sort of 20-30 minutes that I did a recent tour around for the Festival of the Unexplained, the brilliant event run by Karen and Rachel. And it was a tour that got, let's just say, a lot of compliments from people. So I'm hoping that you'll enjoy some of the information I'm going to tell you. And also, if you head on over to YouTube, I've put a little video together with some pictures and things that you can have a look at whilst I'm talking. So, what more do you want? On to Kenilworth. Before I get to Kenilworth, I have had quite a busy September, apart from having a week out due to the dreaded COVID, and it genuinely was COVID, and I genuinely was quite poorly. I also, at the beginning of the month, I was at the Neil Packer's Parameet for the weekend and did a talk there on Victorian schools, kind of to promote the book I wrote called Paranormal Playtime, but also, well, the way the poor are looked after is a subject very, very close to my own heart, as you probably know. After all, I am kind of the workhouse queen, and that's the poor laws. So everything to do with the Victorian era and how they treated the poor, whether it be the schooling, whether it be the workhouse, whether it be how they looked after their mentally ill. I find it fascinating, and any chance I get to talk about it and educate people, I will do so, because, hey, I'm like that. But when I was asked to go back to the Festival of the Unexplained, which was 2 weeks later, they'd said to me, OK, because your tour last year, the Bosworth Field walking tour, was so successful, albeit the fact that it was raining profusely and I think it took me about 2 days to dry out. They said, we're not going to tell you where to go. You know more about this stuff than we do. Give us a location. And before they'd even finished saying, give us a location, I had the location in mind, and that was Kenilworth Castle. About 40 or 50 minutes from Market Bosworth. Nothing particularly to do with Bosworth as an area. It's just an amazing place to visit, and it is one of my favourite castles. Even though it's a ruin, I find the fact that it's a ruin actually makes it more interesting in a perverse kind of way. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I do. So, and as I'm the one talking, unless you don't want to listen to me, you can switch off, can't you? But so I took the group to Kenilworth Castle. Now, nobody knew. The only people who knew where we were going that day were the organisers. So Karen and Rachel, their assistants, Gemma and Nikki, myself, and the coach driver. That was it. And there were some people trying to bribe our lovely coach driver to tell them where we were going, but he stood fast, well, sat fast, I suppose, because he was driving at the time. And then we played a little game on board, and I was giving people clues, quite cryptic clues, and I said they were going to be cryptic, and I think it was the wonderful David Young, the podcaster, David Young, who said, these clues, they're not very easy. And I was like, well, that's why they're cryptic. You'll get the answers when we get to the place we're going. I think one of the clues I gave was, when you think of this place, moo, as in a cow noise. That was one of them. That really threw them. Another one was friends with benefits. You'll get it when I start talking about the castle, what the clues meant. And I think the last one I gave them was that one of its residents hated the colour red. I know they're cryptic. I am that horrible. I'm not going to give them an easy answer. I mean, who wants that? I think they probably did, but that's not what happens, is it? So we got to Kenilworth. A few people realised where they were going as we were approaching. One person said, I lived in Kenilworth for about 20 years. Great. But she didn't actually know that much about the castle, which I found astounding. But then again, I lived in Norwich for 20 years. and it wasn't until I was about 16, 17 that I started learning about Norwich Castle and discovered I actually had an affinity with the place. And when I was feeling a bit stressed, when I was doing my A-levels, I would pay the 50p and go and sit in the castle for 3 hours and calm down. Found it quite cathartic. So, Kenilworth. Well, there'll be pictures coming up on the video of Kenilworth Castle if you want to have a look at what it looks like. But it was built in the 1120s by somebody called Geoffrey de Clinton. Now, Geoffrey de Clinton had been granted the land via Henry I. Henry I being William the Conqueror's second son, because it's William the Conqueror's first son who took the reins of kingship when William the Conqueror died was actually William II, but Henry I. And Geoffrey de Clinton was granted the land by Henry I. Now, when I'm doing these kind of tours, I like to talk to other people who are not going to be on it, so they're not going to let anyone know what I'm going to be saying. And I was around my parents, and they like visiting places like this too. And so I said to them, okay, this is the basic tour. This is the basic what I'm going to be talking about. What question would you ask? And my mum turned round and said, well, Kenilworth's in Warwickshire, right? It is indeed, Mum. So is Warwick Castle. It is indeed. Why are they so close? And I thought that was a good answer. Good question, even. You can tell I'm doing this without a script, can't you? I thought that was a really good question. So I looked it up. And it transpires there is a bit of curtain twitching going on here. Because Henry I was a bit, shall we say, suspicious of what the owner of Warwick Castle was up to. Now, even though Warwick Castle had direct links to Henry I's dad, William the Conqueror, it was being run by the de Beaumont family, and Henry I was a little bit suspicious of them. So he asked his, trusted Geoffrey de Clinton to keep an eye on them, hence how close Kenilworth Castle is to Warwick Castle. Like I say, it's curtain twitching. He was keeping an eye on them, although obviously they didn't have net curtains back in those days, but you get the image that I'm trying to portray. It also had an Augustinian priory attached to it, and it's got loads of... You just look through the timeline. I mean, you've got all these famous names mentioned: Henry II, King John, Eleanor of Aquitaine, so on and so forth, which brings me to the first of the stories that I wanted to talk to people about. And that was a chap by the name of Simon de Montfort. Most of you have probably heard of him if you're into your history. In fact, in Leicester, his name is everywhere. You have de Montfort University. And he was Simon Jr. or Simon II, because his dad was also called Simon de Montfort, and actually his son was also called Simon de Montfort. So, yeah, he was Simon II. He was a bit of a complex character. He'd arrived in England in 1230, looking for his inheritance, as he felt he was justified. And if you study him and read up on him, and I haven't got the time in a 30-minute podcast to talk about him and whether I want to get everything else into it for you, but he came to the UK in 1230, or came to England, in 1230, looking for his inheritance as the Earl of Leicester. The thing was, he was very limited when it came to language. He only spoke French. He didn't speak English. But because French was still being used very, very heavily in court at this point, Henry III, who was the then king, was very sympathetic towards him and was very helpful and gave him money and gave him a status and all of that kind of thing. How did Simon repay him? Well, in 1238, he married Henry's sister, Eleanor of England. Now, you may think, well, he was Henry's friend. What's the big deal? The big deal was that Eleanor, albeit young, had been widowed at the age of 16 and had taken a vow of chastity. She was, as the sister of a king, she was prize political gain. If she had said, no, I'm going to marry again, Henry III, and this sounds awful, but it was the norm, could have used her to gain some kind of foothold into another country, which was done. If you look back through, I mean, even if you go as far forward as you think about it, Queen Victoria, in the 19th century, her children were married off to the kings and queens of Europe to get that sort of, I suppose, inside edge into these foreign countries. Even though Henry wasn't too happy about the fact his sister had gone off and married his friend, he did support them. They appeared to be in love. Simon was very, very religious. He was very, very pious. And actually, it was he that hated the colour red, as he felt it was close to Satan. Obviously, my sort of thoughts on that are that's a bit extreme, but that's what he felt. It was actually in 1238 when he married Eleanor of England, Henry III's sister, that they first moved to Kenilworth. They didn't own it or anything else, but Henry III said that they could live there, and it was there that their first child was born in the November of 1238, called Simon. It wasn't until 1244, 6 years later, that he was given custody of Kenilworth and then given the sort of the life tenancy, I suppose, for want of a better term, in 1253. The problem with Simon de Montfort, well, actually there's quite a few problems, because what character in history isn't flawed when you look at modern day mentalities and modern day sensibilities and stuff. And this is something I could talk about quite extensively, because I find it very, very strange when people decide to cancel a character from history who, while we look at with today's eyes, yes, what they were doing we would find abhorrent, but back in the day it was the norm and it was expected. More on that with Simon in a second. Money was always an issue with de Montfort. He couldn't manage it. He was always needing money. He couldn't make ends meet on the tenancy of a huge estate like Kenilworth. And he actually used his brother-in-law, the king, as a guarantor for some money that he wanted to borrow. Problem was, he didn't actually tell said brother-in-law, the king, that he was going to put his name and start name dropping and say that Henry would guarantee his loan. And when Henry found out, justifiably, he was a bit knocked. He wasn't very happy, and it was at this point he started admitting that he had accepted his brother-in-law's marriage to Eleanor of England, but that didn't mean he was happy about it. And he felt that de Montfort had actually seduced his sister, and the only reason he allowed it was to avoid a scandal. De Montfort is normally also talked about as the father of modern parliamentary democracy. You've heard of things like the Barons' War. Well, he actually was part of the Second Barons' War when, in 1264, excuse me, at the Battle of Lewes, they wanted a government of barons as opposed to just the king's favourites. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we talk about Edward II shortly. People say that de Montfort became, in effect, the uncrowned king of England, and that if it wasn't for him, modern democracy would never have existed. I think that's a bit of a sweeping statement to make, but he certainly was the one who pushed for things like the provisions of Oxford, the Oxford Parliament, where the king didn't have, in effect, the autocratic rule and decision when parliaments were called. There had to be regular parliaments, and also the people representing the country in parliament couldn't just be who the king chose as, well, yes, men. And that's not me being sexist, it would have just been men. But what they wanted was people who might actually challenge some of the decisions and challenge what the king wanted to use the tax funds for, and all of those things that we now would see as being completely and utterly common sense. Back then they were having to fight for it. It was actually Henry III overthrowing this Oxford Parliament, this provisions of Oxford to do this kind of thing, that did actually lead to the Second Barons' War from 1263 to 1267. And there was actually a second parliament. I mean, you think the parliaments weren't actually held that often, but there was a parliament in March 1265 where even local representatives, albeit quite high up local representatives, not your hoi polloi, were actually part of the parliament to sort of talk about what local issues actually were. De Montfort, though, has got some bad sides to him. And sometimes it's these bad sides that makes it hard to see someone for the good that they might have done, him being that he wanted democracy and not autocracy. He was not a fan of Jews. And most people get really confused and they think that the Jewish persecution really started from sort of Hitler in the Second World War. But, oh man, it goes back 1,000 years before that. Was it to do with the fact he was a strict Catholic and anyone who wasn't following that particular religion was classed as a heretic and deserved, if they weren't prepared to change their minds, deserved to be killed? I don't know. We know that he didn't actually do the killing, but he allowed his followers to murder Jews to destroy baronial debt. Now, under Catholic law, you couldn't lend money for monetary gain, whereas the Jewish population were allowed to. And it was something called usury. And now, if these people who you owed money to were dead, your debt died with them. So was this a religious thing, or was it a way of cancelling a debt? Who knows? Who knows? Nobody really knows for sure. I have my thoughts. I think it was 6 or 1.5 dozen of the other. But he also sent through a dictum that said that Jews weren't allowed to live or work or whatever in Leicester, which sounds absolutely horrifying until you find out that actually were no Jews living or working in Leicester at the point. It was more done for, look how wonderful I am, I'm trying to protect you. But he had his faults. Now, he did actually die at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. So you'd think that would be the end of his episode. But no, because that led on to something called the Siege of Kenilworth Castle. This is very sad. It is as dramatic as it sounds, and if you're interested, I do sort of recommend going off and reading more about this era. This siege was the longest siege in English history. It took place over nearly 6 months. Now, I'm betting you that Henry III, he kind of wants his castle back. Simon de Montfort's dead. He is now an enemy of the state. He wants his building back. It's a bit like an episode of Nightmare Tenants, Slum Landlords, and I can almost imagine them getting that company that come out to do all the legal wrangling to get the person to leave the property. I can almost imagine them sort of knocking on the portcullis and saying, "Excuse me, your tenancy's up." But it was a bit more dramatic than that, because Eleanor de Montfort, Eleanor of England, Henry III's sister, wasn't actually there. She had actually gone to Dover Castle down in Kent, and from there she went to France and actually lived out the rest of her life in an abbey after becoming friends with the French Queen. Now, in June 1266, Henry III realises he's possibly cocked up somewhat by giving one of his most heavily fortified castles to, in effect, rebels. Bit of a mistake. A few months earlier, when he'd initially, after the Battle of Evesham, he had actually sent one of his messengers to the castle because Simon de Montfort III had actually said, yeah, we'll give it back. No worries, it's yours, we'll give it back. And Henry had sent a messenger to the castle to say, come on, get your backsides out, it's mine, I want it back. Well, that envoy returned with a severed hand. And that's actually what led to this siege beginning. Now, it's actually down to pretty much the castle's commander, one Henry de Hastings, who said the only person that could make the decision to give the castle back was actually Eleanor, not Simon III. And Eleanor was not making the decision. So unless she was making a decision to say, give it back, we ain't giving it back. It's a bit like if your dad says, no, what did your mum say? Or vice versa with kids. But anyway, if you ever look at the site, ever look at the size of Kenilworth, they set up 4 siege camps. Henry, Edmund, his 2 sons, and someone called Roger de Mortimer set up these camps surrounding the castle. But within the castle walls, there was probably around 1,200 people, including women and children. It was almost like a village in its own right. The king used trebuchets, those big catapult things big wooden catapult things you've probably seen on television programmes. They were met with even bigger trebuchets because it transpires that Simon de Montfort II had been actually accruing weapons behind those walls. It's almost like he knew something was going to happen. Henry III set up assault towers with hundreds of archers on them to try and get over the walls. Those were destroyed too. Bear in mind, it would have been very, very hard for him to breach the walls because Kenilworth Castle at this point was surrounded by water, something called the mere. And if you ever have a look at it and you can see the sunken ground that's around the castle, imagine that full of water. It would have been very, very hard to break through. Because he couldn't get over the walls with conventional means, he got barges sailed up from nearby Chester. They scuppered those. That didn't work either. In the July, Cardinal Ottobueno excommunicates everyone inside the castle on behalf of the Pope. I mean, for people who are Catholic and strictly Catholic, this would have been a pretty terrifying perspective. What do the rebels do? They dress their castle doctor in white and have him excommunicate the king. Kind of tit for tat almost. In the October, at the end of the October, something called the Dictum of Kenilworth was issued because the king realised that they weren't going to give in. They weren't going to give in. They knew if they give in, they're all dead. All the barons that were supporting Simon are going to be dead. So they issued the Dictum of Kenilworth, but the rebels said it was too harsh. Whilst it wasn't throwing out death penalties left, right and centre, it was taking away people's lands, people's livelihoods. And a lot of these barons, they relied on the rent and stuff from their lands to actually make ends meet. And whilst this would allow the majority of people to leave unharmed, especially those who didn't own property or land, the only way those who'd had it taken away from them could get it back was by payment of extortionate fines, which they wouldn't have had because they didn't have the means to raise the money. Now, the only people who weren't going to get away with it was Hastings, the castle commander, remember the one who said he wouldn't give it back unless Eleanor said so, and any of those they find had harmed that king's messenger, the poor one who lost his hand. It wasn't until the 13th of December, so nearly 6 months after it started, that the castle surrendered. And the only reason they surrendered was because they'd run out of supplies. They were starving. They were eating their horses. They were, sucking on bits of leather, all the things they would try to do to get some kind of sustenance in them. It wasn't to do with the castle's defences or anything like that. They had purely run out of supplies to do so. They say, the history books and historians say that they had something like 2 days' worth of food and water left. Otherwise, they would have been starving to death. Now, Henry basically ran England from Kenilworth for the 6 months that the siege took place, and he was staying at a place called where the Abbey is, and he is said to have basically bled the Abbey dry, robbed all of its resources. And that's where, if you ever go to Kenilworth, there's an area called Abbey Fields, and that's where the Abbey was. But for 6 months, the whole of England was governed from Kenilworth Castle. Can you see why I think it's a pretty cool place? I'm going to go on to another story now for you. There's quite a few, so I might make a second one of this talking about some of the latter day events or towards the 1400s and 1500s. But let's go forward to the last one that I'm going to talk about on this particular podcast, Edward II. Now, those of you who were actually listening, who were there when I did this talk, you're probably already crossing your legs and grimacing a wee bit. But we're fast forwarding now to 1326. We're jumping in that time machine that only historians can do. We can ping backwards and forwards like a time machine elastic band when we need to. But the current King Edward II, bit of a wally, if you ask me, he's been captured by forces, encouraged by his wife, Queen Isabella, who actually I think was quite cool. And they want him to abdicate in favour of his son, Edward III. Why would they want a king to abdicate? What could he have possibly done that would force a whole country to basically rise up in, well, they weren't even afraid of him. No, they wanted him to step down. They didn't want to kill him. They didn't want to execute him at the time. They just wanted him to say, okay, I'm not a great king. My son might do better. Well, actually, his wife, Isabella, could have done better, but that's by the by. Let's just say that Edward never expected to be king. He was so far down the pecking order of his family, it's probably not something that would even have crossed his mind was ever going to happen. But he was. His problem was, though, that he was, let's just say, more interested in his special friends than he was in doing a good job as a king. His first one that most people will have heard of was a guy by the name of Piers Gaveston. I kind of have a bit of sympathy for Piers, and it transpires that Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, didn't seem to care about Gaveston one way or the other. She knew her husband liked to spend a lot of time with him, and bear in mind, this was in the day and age that if you were found to be committing the act of sodomy, you were executed, and not in a nice way. But the barons, again, who pretty much ran the country, you remember what I said about Simon de Montfort, he was one of those barons 60 years previously. They didn't like Gaveston. They felt he was too influential on the king. I mean, he'd been granted the manor at Cornwall just because of who he was. He couldn't run a place, but because he was the king's special friend, he was given an awful lot of gifts. Now, he ended up being murdered by 2 Welshmen on a place called Blacklow Hill, which is probably about 2 miles from Kenilworth, and this was in 1312. But if those people who, shall we say, orchestrated that thought that would be the end of their problems, they were very, very far from that, and it got even worse when the new special friend was Hugh Le Despencer Jr. Now, he really was the reason that the king was forced to abdicate. Gaveston had mocked, before he died, the Earl of Lancaster, Thomas, who actually lived in Kenilworth Castle. That was his domain. Thomas didn't like being mocked, and he is partly the reason that Gaveston met his demise via 2 Welshmen at Blacklow Hill. By 1321, the new boyfriend, and he basically was his boyfriend, I'm not actually being sarcastic here, and his father are running things. Edward isn't really doing much apart from signing official seals and saying yes to whatever they want. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, living at Kenilworth, is really unhappy, and this leads to a revolt called the Battle of Boroughbridge. But unfortunately, it did not go Thomas's way, and he was captured and set to be tried for treason, basically, for going against the king. Sounds quite logical, really, doesn't it? But when you think about the fact that the trial was conducted by Despencer Jr., that the Earl of Lancaster was not allowed to speak or have anyone come forward in his defence as to why he did it, it was a done deal. It was a kangaroo court, for want of a better term, and as a result of it, he was executed. He was beheaded. Now, officially for treason, you were supposed to be hung, drawn and quartered, but Edward II, this was his cousin at the end of the day, Edward II said no, he's to be beheaded. I'm going to be merciful here. However, Thomas's fame continued long after his death because his body was placed in Pontefract, in the abbey in Pontefract, and thousands of people went to pay homage to him. And in fact, there's even stories that he cured people, like posthumously. He was curing people by seeing his grave. People were being cured. And let's just say, Edward didn't like that too much, and he banned people from going. And in fact, there was actually a riot, and some of the guards who were supposed to be stopping people going anywhere near Thomas's grave, his crypt, were actually killed as a result. Now, this was another thing that sort of provoked Isabella, Queen Isabella. She had had enough. She had had enough of Despencer and the way. Now, it makes you wonder what exactly he did, that he was that bad that she would want to actually kick her husband off the throne so she could get rid of Despencer. She'd been in France. She's quite a savvy lady. A good book on her. I think it's Alison Weir's book on her. It's very, very good. Very interesting. And she was over in France with Roger Mortimer, the grandson of Roger de Mortimer, who had been part of the siege 60 years earlier. And he had been exiled to France because he'd upset Edward II. Long story. Not going to cover it right now. And her and him, Isabella and Roger, started a relationship. Oh, the scandal. The Queen of England, who is still married, is in an illicit relationship with someone who's been exiled to another country. they invade England and they succeed, and basically wherever they go, people are following them. People have had enough of the dispensers. And I'm sure Isabella had as well. I mean, there was one statistic I read that her annual stipend was about £10,000 a year. Dispenser came in, Dispenser Junior, and reduced that to 1,000. And this is the Queen of England he's doing this to. He took properties of hers and said he wanted them instead. I mean, the man he needed to be stopped. When they got to England, when Isabella and Mortimer got to England, and when they won, the first of the dispensers to be executed was Dispenser the Elder. He was hanged in Bristol, and then his body was beheaded and cut up and fed to the dogs in October 1326. With Dispenser the Younger, they decided to give him a similar trial to what he'd given the Earl of Lancaster. The Earl of Lancaster's younger brother, Henry, was now in that role, and he despised the man. As you can probably imagine, the guy, in effect, murdered his big brother. So he was actually hung, drawn and quartered, and also castrated. And now this is where it gets interesting, because castration was normally only used for people who had been tried for sodomy, or for people who had been openly part of some kind of sexual assault. And Alison Weir, in her book, surmises that there is evidence to show that something happened with him and Isabella when she was in England and Queen, whether he had raped her or whether he had persuaded Edward that they should have an open marriage, so they should share their wives. We don't know, but we know that Isabella absolutely despised him. And she wasn't a stupid, emotional woman. She was very, very clever. He was executed on the 24th of November, 1326, in Hereford. By this point, Edward II is actually at Kenilworth Castle. That's where he's being held under Henry, the Thomas of Lancaster's little brother. Isabella obviously wants her son to take the throne, Edward III, but Edward II won't actually abdicate. And Edward III says, I won't accept it unless my dad formally abdicates. We've got a bit of a sticking point here, so they start using, let's just say, bribery and corruption. They turn round and tell Edward II that the barons are meeting and they're going to take him off the throne whether he likes it or not. And if his son won't accept the throne, well, Roger Mortimer will. Kind of a bit like adding fuel to a fire there. Eventually, Edward, albeit in tears, abdicates, and he signed his abdication papers in the Great Hall at Kenilworth Castle. So if you ever go there, that's where the King of England signed his abdication papers. After that, he was actually moved to Berkeley Castle, who, actually, funnily enough, my good friend Tom Horton has just done a podcast on. He has a podcast called Bad Manners, which you should have a listen to. And he's actually talking about Berkeley Castle with one of the family members who still lives there, about what happened to Edward II. Now, the story is, allegedly, he was murdered with a red-hot poker up a certain orifice. Reason being is that would basically kill the person from inside, but there'd be no external signs of injury, so it could just be said that they died naturally. But then there's also rumours that he decided to become a hermit and lived a quiet life until he actually died of old age. But nobody, like so many other things in history, we don't know for sure. Now, even Edward III had heard the story that his mum had had an illegitimate child with Roger Mortimer at Kenilworth, but we don't know. What we do know is Edward III became a king. He seems to have done quite a good job. He still cared greatly for his mother. He didn't imprison her at Castle Rising. She was kind of under house arrest, but she was still allowed to travel, and she was still consulted on things to do with the country and Parliament. She was a very well-respected woman, unlike her late husband, who wasn't. So, that's just been a bit of a talk about Kenilworth Castle and why I think it's so blooming fascinating. And if you do get a chance to go there, do. I might do a part 2 of this at some point, because I've still got some other bits and bobs to talk to you about, not least the Friends with Benefits. Basically, Queen Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. What did I think of them? So, if you like what you hear, make sure you do follow Haunted Histories, and there will be more podcasts coming up over the rest of this year, and who knows what I'll be talking about. But thank you for listening. Thank you for following Haunted Histories if you do already follow Haunted Histories, and I hope this one-off podcast with just me rambling for 30 minutes was enjoyable. Bye all. Have a good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.